The mansion stood at the edge of town like something out of a dream. Its windows caught the morning light and reflected it in sharp fragments across the wide lawns, the kind of lawns that never seemed to lose their perfect shade of green. It was the kind of place people whispered about, but rarely entered. The kind of home that belonged not just to money, but to power. Inside, the hallways stretched long and cold, lined with portraits that stared down with silent judgment. For most, life there seemed untouchable, insulated from the problems of the world outside its iron gates. But behind the heavy doors and tall walls, something far more fragile was unfolding, something that wealth couldn't hide forever. The owner of that house was a man who had built his fortune with ruthless discipline. He was admired by some, feared by others, and envied by nearly everyone. His wealth gave him control over almost everything, over business, over people, even over the rhythm of life inside his own home. Yet beneath all that control lay a single soft spot: his son. The boy, born with a body that never quite obeyed him, lived in the shadows of his father's power. He was fragile, with movements that came slowly, speech that stumbled, and a spirit that many thought would be broken by the weight of his own limitations. But inside the boy's quiet eyes, there was a kind of light, something innocent, something hopeful, something untouched by the sharp edges of the world. In that house also lived a man who was not family, not powerful, and certainly not wealthy. He was the cook, a tall man with strong hands and a gentle presence. His skin marked him as different in a place and time where difference was not easily forgiven. He worked in the background, moving through the kitchen with practiced ease, feeding the household without ever being truly seen. To outsiders, he was only a servant. To those within the mansion, he was someone to be tolerated, spoken to when needed, dismissed when not. Yet in the quiet hours, when the bustle of wealth fell silent, he carried with him something rare, kindness that asked for nothing in return. The house ran like a well-oiled machine. Meals came out on time, polished silver reflected in the chandeliers, and staff moved quietly through their duties. But behind the perfection of that routine lingered unspoken truths. The millionaire's wife had long since slipped into her own world of distant smiles and quiet sighs, too weary to fight against the coldness that ruled her home. The son lived his days mostly in silence, his father's pride weighed down by unspoken shame. And the cook, though invisible to most, carried the heavy knowledge of where he stood in a house where money and skin color divided people long before words were even spoken. For anyone looking in from the outside, it seemed normal. A rich man with his estate, his family, his staff. A boy cared for, though differently. A cook who worked quietly in the background. But under that surface, threads of tension stretched thin. Power had a way of pressing down on everything, shaping the air in that house, making even small acts feel heavier than they should. A look could carry the weight of judgment. A silence could echo louder than words. And behind it all was the quiet fact that some rules in that home were never to be broken. No one could have guessed how quickly those fragile threads would snap. It started not with violence, not with rage, but with something small, something almost tender. A moment when the cook, after long hours of work, found the boy alone in a quiet room, his body restless, his eyes searching for some spark of joy. The boy wanted to move, to feel free, to forget for just a moment that his body betrayed him. And the cook, without hesitation, gave him that moment. He moved, slow at first, then steady, guiding the boy's awkward movements into something like rhythm. It wasn't perfect, but it was joy, raw and pure. A dance, fragile and fleeting, in the middle of a house built on rules and walls. That small act, unseen by most, would become the seed of something much larger. In a place ruled by control and appearances, it was dangerous. Because in that moment, The boy smiled in a way his father had never been able to make him smile. In that moment, the cook became more than just a servant. And in that moment, a boundary was crossed, not of touch or words, but of power. The house did not tremble then. The walls did not fall. The air stayed quiet. But like a storm far on the horizon, something was coming. Something that would twist that fragile joy into something darker, something that would leave everyone inside that house changed forever. And while no one could see it yet, the first step toward tragedy had already been taken. The dance should have been harmless, a fleeting moment no one would remember. But in a house where power was currency and control was everything, nothing was ever that simple. The boy's laughter had echoed down the hallway that day, bright and unrestrained. To his father, who happened to hear it from afar, it was strange, even unsettling. He had spent years trying to coax pride from his son, only to be met with struggle and silence. And now here was the seeker, Oak, a man meant to remain in the background, pulling from his boy something he himself had never managed to unlock. That single sound, his son's laughter, planted a seed of resentment that began to grow in quiet corners of his mind. The millionaire was not a man who tolerated being overshadowed, especially not by someone he considered beneath him. He watched more closely after that, his eyes narrowing whenever the cook and the boy were in the same room. He noticed the way the boy looked at him differently, less fearful, almost defiant, as though that single act of kindness had carved out a secret space in his heart. And it bothered him deeply. Love was supposed to be something he controlled, something that belonged to him by right of blood and wealth. But now, affection was being stolen by someone who, in his eyes, had no right to it. Tension grew slowly, almost invisible at first. Small things began to irritate him, meals that weren't seasoned exactly to his liking, footsteps that echoed too loudly in the kitchen, a gaze that lingered for a moment too long. Each offense, though minor, built upon the last. In the privacy of his study, he replayed the dance in his mind, twisting it into something threatening, something disrespectful. What had begun as innocent soon looked to him like betrayal. The cook, meanwhile, carried no sense of danger in his heart. To him, the boy was a child in need of joy, and he gave it without hesitation. He continued to spend quiet moments teaching him little movements, clapping out rhythms, making him laugh when his body refused to obey. But he noticed the millionaire's gaze more often now. The sharp way his employer's eyes lingered, the silence that followed his footsteps into the kitchen, the weight of words left unspoken. Something in the air shifted, though he couldn't yet name it. The boy himself felt the change most of all. For years he had lived in the quiet sorrow of his father's disappointment. But with the cook, he felt a kind of freedom he didn't know was possible. He began seeking him out more often, slipping into the kitchen under the excuse of hunger, lingering at the door just to watch him move. And in his father's presence, he grew bolder. He would laugh openly, smile where he once stayed silent, and even defend the cook when harsh words were thrown his way. The father noticed every glance, every word, every small act of loyalty, and each one cut deeper than the last. But it wasn't only the dynamics inside the house pressing down on them. Outside, whispers carried their own weight. In town, people talked about the cook's presence in the mansion. They talked about how unusual it was for a man like him, marked by color and poverty, to serve so close to a family of wealth. Some spoke with pity, others with venom, but the words always traveled back. Servants gossiped in hushed tones, sharing glances when the master entered the room, and though nothing was ever said outright, the weight of judgment grew heavy. For the millionaire who prized his image above all, the whispers were unbearable. It wasn't only that he felt betrayed, it was that others might see it too. The wife, though quiet, saw more than she let on. She watched her husband's growing temper, the way his jaw clenched when the cook entered the room, the coldness in his voice when he addressed him. She had long since given up on softening her husband's heart, but now, fear began to creep in. Not fear of the cook, who she knew was gentle, but fear of what her husband might do if his pride was pushed too far. She wanted to intervene, to warn, but years of silence had trained her to remain still. Her own secrets, buried deep, held her back from stepping into the light. The cook has his own past, one that whispered to him in the quiet moments before sleep. He had known what it was like to be treated as less than human. He had felt the sting of cruelty in places where his skin alone marked him as guilty, and yet he carried those scars without letting them turn him bitter. But now, working in this mansion, those memories stirred again. He could feel the familiar weight of suspicion, the careful way people watched him, the sharp edge of their judgments. Still, he chose kindness. But kindness, in a world like this, was often mistaken for defiance. As weeks passed, the air grew thicker. The millionaire began setting traps, small tests meant to catch the cook in errors. He demanded meals be prepared in ways he had never before requested, scolded him for imagined mistakes, and reminded him constantly of his place. The boy, watching this cruelty unfold, clung even tighter to the cook, refusing to let go of the one person who made him feel whole. Each act of resistance, no matter how small, fueled his father's fury. One night, when the house was quiet and the staff had retreated to their quarters, the boy begged the cook to dance again. They moved together in the dim glow of the kitchen lantern, the boy's laughter soft but free. Neither of them knew that footsteps were approaching, that eyes full of rage were watching from the shadows. The father stood in the doorway, unseen, his face twisting as he watched his son find joy in someone else's arms. In that moment, the seed of resentment grew into something darker. Obsession, the kind that would not rest until order was restored. The boy's innocence blinded him to the danger. To him, the cook was not just a servant, but a friend, perhaps even the only person who truly saw him. But innocence has its limits, and beneath it, fear began to stir. He noticed the way his father's anger burned hotter, the way his mother avoided his eyes, the way the cook seemed heavier, quieter, as though he carried a weight he could not share. He began to feel torn between love for the man who gave him life and loyalty to the one who gave him joy. That tension, though unspoken, began to eat away at him. The cook too began to feel the strain. Every act of kindness now carries risk. Every smile he gave the boy might be misread. Every moment of joy turned into evidence against him. He considered pulling away, retreating into silence, but each time he saw the boy's eager eyes, he found himself unable to do it. He had lived his life being unseen, and now, for the first time, someone looked at him as though he mattered. That look, fragile and fleeting, was worth the danger. By then, the walls of the mansion seemed to close in tighter each day. Conversations grew sharper, silences longer, glances more poisonous. The millionaire's obsession with control spread like rot, touching every corner of the house. What once seemed like minor irritations now felt like betrayals. What once was love now looked like rebellion. And beneath it all, a storm gathered, silent but inevitable, waiting for the moment when one spark would set it all ablaze. The fragile balance that had once held the house together was gone. Every step, every word, every glance carried weight, and though no one could yet see the shape of it, the path toward tragedy had already been carved. All it would take was one moment, one outburst, one act of defiance for the storm to break loose. And when it did, nothing in that house would ever be the same again. The night of the crime arrived quietly like any other. The mansion sat in stillness under a heavy sky, the kind of silence that felt unnatural, waiting for something to break it. Inside, the boy was restless. He had spent the day under his father's watchful eye, feeling the weight of disapproval in every glance, every sharp word. He longed for escape, for the lightness that only came when the cook was near. By evening, His body ached with the tension of holding himself small, and he slipped from his room like a shadow, his thin legs dragging just a little as he moved toward the kitchen. The cook was there, as always, finishing the last of his duties. The boy's arrival brought a smile that softened the long hours of the day. He set aside the dishes, knelt, and gave his full attention to him. The boy's voice was quiet, almost pleading. He wanted to dance again. Just one more time, in the warmth of the kitchen, away from the cold stares and cruel silence that filled the rest of the house. And though the cook hesitated, feeling the tension that had been building for weeks, he could not say no. The lantern light flickered, casting soft shadows across the tiled floor. The cook guided the boy gently, swaying with him, letting him move in his own broken rhythm. The boy laughed, a sound that filled the kitchen with life, fragile but beautiful. For a moment, it was as if the world outside that room did not exist. For a moment, there was only joy. But footsteps broke the spell. Heavy, deliberate, echoing down the hallway like a warning. The boy froze, his laughter caught in his throat. The cook turned, his body stiffening, as the doorway filled with the figure of the millionaire. His face was carved from rage, eyes cold and sharp, jaw tight as though he had been waiting for this moment. The silence that followed was unbearable. The father's eyes moved from his son to the cook and back again, reading the closeness between them, twisting it into something shameful in his mind. His chest rose and fell with controlled fury, the kind that sat on the edge of explosion. When he finally spoke, his voice was low, trembling not with fear, but with restrained violence. "What is this?" The boy stammered, reaching out as if to explain, but no words came. The cook, steady but fearful, tried to speak, his voice calm but firm. He only wanted to feel free. It was a truth, simple and unthreatening, but in the father's ears, it sounded like defiance, like mockery. The tension snapped. The millionaire stepped forward, his anger spilling over into action. He accused, he shouted, words laced with venom, each one a strike meant to humiliate. The boy cried out, trying to protect the cook, placing himself between them. But his father's fury was beyond reason. In that moment, power and pride outweighed love. The cook raised his hands in defense, not to strike, but to shield himself from the storm. But the millionaire, blinded by rage, saw the gesture as a challenge. His hand struck first, sharp across the boy's fragile shoulder, as he shoved him aside. The sound of the boy's body hitting the floor was sharp, final, cutting through the kitchen air like a blade. His cry pierced the silence, and the cook rushed forward to lift him. That single act, his arms around the boy, ignited the final spark. To the millionaire, it was proof of everything he feared, that his son's loyalty had been stolen, that respect had been stripped from him, that he was no longer the center of his own household. In that twisted instant, violence became inevitable. The father reached for the nearest object, a heavy iron pan left on the stove. His hand gripped it tightly, his knuckles pale with force. The cook looked up, eyes wide, realizing too late the depth of the danger. There was no time to move, no time to shield himself. The first blow came down with a sickening thud, the weight of it reverberating through the kitchen walls. The boy screamed, his voice raw, desperate. He pulled at his father's sleeve, begged him to stop, but the man was lost to his own fury. Again and again the pan came down, each strike louder than the last, each one echoing with years of unspoken bitterness, fear and rage. Blood pooled across the tiles, mixing with the dim lantern light, the sharp metallic scent filling the room. The cook's body crumpled under the assault, but still, for a moment he clung to life, his eyes fixed on the boy. Those eyes, even as they dimmed, were not filled with hatred. They held sorrow, yes, but also something softer. Understanding, forgiveness. As if even in his final breath, He wished to spare the boy the weight of guilt. That look broke something inside the boy, who cried until his voice gave out, his hands shaking as they clutched at the fading warmth of the man who had given him joy. When the silence finally returned, it was heavier than before. The millionaire stood over the body, his chest heaving, the iron pan slipping from his hand to the floor with a dull clang. His face was pale, streaked with sweat, his eyes wide as though he himself could not believe what he had done. For a long moment, he simply stood there, frozen in the horror of his own actions. Then came the denial. He muttered under his breath, words jumbled, insisting it had been necessary, that the man had overstepped, that he had protected what was his. He crouched down, pressing trembling fingers to the cook's neck, only to find no pulse. His hands came back red, and the sight of it seemed to shake him further. The boy crawled to the body, sobbing, refusing to let go. His small hands smeared with blood as he tried to wake him, shaking him, begging him to open his eyes. His cries filled the kitchen, raw and piercing, until his father yanked him away. But the boy fought, his weak limbs thrashing, his voice breaking as he screamed that it was his fault, that he should have protected him. The wife arrived then, drawn by the noise. She entered the kitchen and froze at the sight, the cook's lifeless body, her husband standing over him, their son soaked in blood and tears. Her hand flew to her mouth, but no sound came. She understood instantly what had happened, and in her eyes was not only horror, but also inevitability. She had seen this storm building for weeks, perhaps even years, and now it had broken. Millionaire turned to her, his face wild, desperate. He spoke quickly, demanding her silence, insisting they would cover it, that no one would know. He framed it as a matter of survival, of protecting the family, of saving their son from scandal. But beneath the words was fear. Not fear of the law, not yet, but fear of losing control of the world he had so carefully built. She did not answer, not at first. She only stared at the man she had married, the man who had crossed a line from which there was no return. Her silence cut deeper than words, and for the first time, the millionaire felt something close to shame. The immediate aftermath was chaos wrapped in quiet. The staff, though alerted by the noise, dared not enter. The wife stood frozen. The boy wept until exhaustion overtook him, and the father paced, muttering, wiping his hands, trying to piece together a story that would absolve him. Outside, the world remained unaware, the night still heavy and calm. But inside the mansion, something irreversible had happened. The kitchen floor bore witness to it all, the broken lantern flickering weakly, the blood seeping between the tiles, the pan lying cold on the ground. The crime had unfolded not in the chaos of strangers, not in the dark alleys of the city, but in the very heart of a home, where power, love and pride had collided with deadly force. Nothing about that night could be undone, and though the silence that followed seemed almost peaceful, it was only the beginning of the storm that would consume them all. The mansion never felt quiet in the same way again. In the days after the killing, the silence was not simply the absence of sound. It was a weight, a suffocating heaviness that pressed against the walls and into the hearts of those inside. The kitchen was scrubbed clean, the blood washed away, the iron pan hidden, but the memory lingered in every corner. No amount of polish could erase what had been done. The millionaire carried himself with a strange mixture of denial and restless energy. He moved through the house with a kind of forced calm, speaking as if nothing had changed, giving orders with his usual sharpness. But at night, when the halls were still, he paced like a trapped animal, muttering to himself, rehearsing explanations no one had asked for. In his mind, he framed the killing as something necessary, a defense of his family, of his pride, of his place in the world. Yet the image of blood on his hands returned again and again, no matter how he tried to push it away. He washed his hands obsessively, as though the stain might be scrubbed from his skin, But it was not his hands that were marked. It was his soul. His wife watched him with a kind of weary dread. She had lived beside his temper for years, but this was something beyond anger. He was unraveling. He avoided her eyes, spoke to her only in commands or clipped reassurances that everything would be fine. But she knew it was not fine. She had seen the body of the cook, a man who had shown their son more kindness than his own father ever had. She could not sleep at night, not from fear of her husband, but from the crushing weight of guilt. Guilt for staying silent all these years, for watching tension grow and never stepping forward to stop it. Her silence now was no different, and it hollowed her out from the inside. The boy carried the heaviest burden of all. He had witnessed it. Every strike, every sigh, every final breath. He replayed it endlessly in his mind, unable to stop, unable to look away. He felt torn in two, love for the man who had raised him and hatred for what he had done, grief for the friend he had lost, and guilt for having wanted that dance in the first place. At night, he dreamed of the cook's eyes, not filled with anger, but with something gentler, as if forgiving him even in death. That look haunted him, a reminder that he had been loved and had lost it most brutally. He grew quieter, more withdrawn. Even his laughter, once rare but bright, disappeared entirely. Outside the walls of the mansion, the disappearance of the cook could not go unnoticed. The staff whispered, their voices sharp with suspicion. They knew he had not left of his own accord. He had no family nearby, no money to run, no reason to vanish without a word. The boy's fits of sobbing behind closed doors, the mistress's pale face, the master's sudden bursts of anger. It all painted a picture the servants dared not say aloud. They stayed because work was scarce, and leaving would raise more questions, but they carried the truth in their silences. The community, too, began to ask questions. The cook had been known in town, seen at markets, greeting neighbors with quiet politeness. When he stopped appearing, people noticed. Rumors spread quickly. Some whispered that he had run away after some scandal, others that he had crossed the Millionaire in some way and been sent off. The weight of race and class tilted the conversation. Many were quick to believe the worst of him, but those who knew his gentle nature found the story harder to swallow. When questions grew too loud, the millionaire crafted his story. He told neighbors and anyone who asked that the cook had been caught stealing, that he had dismissed him without ceremony, and that he had been sent away with nothing. He spoke with authority, the kind that few dared to challenge, and for a while the story held. But shadows lingered. The boy's eyes, hollow and red-rimmed, told a different story to anyone who looked closely. The wife's strained silence was its own confession, and though no proof had yet surfaced, the mansion's reputation began to tarnish. The media caught whispers too. A wealthy man dismissing a servant in disgrace was hardly news on its own, but the story of a sudden disappearance, coupled with the silence of those inside the house, carried an unsettling tone. A few small reports surfaced, hinting at mystery, though careful not to point fingers directly at the man of wealth. But in hushed tones, behind closed doors, the community wondered if the truth was darker than anyone dared say. For the millionaire, this shift in perception was intolerable. His pride had been bruised by whispers long before the killing, and now they seemed to multiply. He threw himself deeper into his businesses, into maintaining his image, lashing out at anyone who questioned him. Yet the more he tried to control the narrative, the more brittle he became. Behind closed doors, he lashed out at his family, berating his wife for her silence, snapping at his son for his withdrawn nature. He blamed them for his own crumbling reputation, refusing to see that it was his actions alone that had set the course. The psychological toll rippled outward. The wife retreated further into herself, haunted not only by what had been done, but by the realization that she no longer recognized the man she had married. She thought often of leaving, but where would she go? Society would never allow her to step away from her husband without ruin. So she stayed, bound not by love but by fear of disgrace, a prisoner in her own home. The boy, however, could not simply endure. The trauma weighed too heavily. He grew sickly, his body weakened by grief and silence. He stopped eating, stopped speaking for long stretches, as though words themselves were dangerous. When he did speak, it was often in whispers to no one, as though he were talking to the cook, still carrying him in memory. His father tried to force strength into him, barking orders, demanding discipline, but the boy only shrank further into himself. What the father had tried to destroy, his son's bond with another, lived on in the form of grief, and it became the greatest punishment he could not escape. In the town, the story never fully died. People remembered. Some spoke of the cook's kindness, others of the strange coldness of the mansion after he vanished. Children whispered rumors of a ghost in the house, a restless spirit lingering where injustice had been done. Adults spoke more carefully, but suspicion remained, an unspoken accusation hanging over the family's name. In the end, the crime had ripple effects far beyond the act itself. It destroyed the fragile bonds of the family, leaving them bound together only by silence and fear. It fractured the community's trust, leaving whispers that would never be silenced, and it consumed each of the key players from within, the father with his denial, the mother with her guilt, and the boy with his grief. The cook, though gone, remained present in memory, in whispers, in the unshakable feeling that something pure had been stolen from the world. And while no court had yet judged the crime, while no law had yet named it, the punishment lived on inside those walls, echoing through the silence that followed every night. The mansion, once a symbol of wealth and power, now stood as something else. A reminder of how quickly control could turn to ruin, how pride could destroy what love had built, and how the truth, no matter how deeply buried, lingered in the shadows, waiting to be seen. In the end, the truth had a way of clawing its way out, no matter how carefully someone tried to bury it. For weeks the mansion's silence held, but silence rarely lasts forever. The cook's disappearance remained a wound in the community. Whispers grew into suspicions, and suspicions demanded answers. Servants carrying their own quiet guilt began to talk. A detail slipped here, a murmur there, until the story reached ears that could not ignore it. Authorities came knocking, not because the wealthy man confessed, but because lies rarely hold steady when built on fear. The investigation that followed tore apart what little remained of the family's facade. Bloodstains missed in the kitchen's cracks, contradictions in the master's story, and the haunting testimony of his son, fragile, trembling, but determined enough to speak, formed a picture that could not be denied. The boy, though broken by grief, carried within his mum the truth, and when asked, he could not lie. His words were hesitant, quiet, but they carried the weight of everything he had seen. His father had taken from him the only light he had known, and in the end, that truth became louder than wealth or power. The trial that followed was brutal. The millionaire, once untouchable, stood in a courtroom stripped of his control. The world saw not a man of prestige, but a man accused of cruelty, of murder, of letting pride turn into bloodshed. He fought it, of course. His lawyers spun stories of self-defense, of misunderstanding, of loyalty gone too far. He stood tall, trying to summon the authority he once wielded, but something in him faltered. The image of the pan, the sound of his son's screams, the body on the floor, these things could not be dressed in excuses forever. The verdict came, and with it, the fall. Guilty. His sentence was not only years in a cell, but the collapse of the empire he had built. Business partners turned their backs, friends disappeared. The community that once envied him now spat his name like poison. His legacy, once polished and envied, was reduced to a cautionary tale of how power can rot the soul. Behind prison walls, his wealth meant little. He was left with only the memory of his crime, and the silence that no longer belonged to his mansion, but to his own conscience. His wife, too, paid a price. Though she never lifted a hand, she carried the weight of complicity. Her silence during those crucial moments chained her to the tragedy. Society turned its eyes on her, some with pity, others with disdain. She faded into the background, a woman whose face told a story without needing words. Her life became one of quiet endurance, living with the ghost of what she could have prevented. In the end, her punishment was not handed down by a judge, but by the unrelenting truth of her own guilt. The boy's life was changed beyond recognition. He grew older, but the innocence of childhood was forever lost in that kitchen. He carried scars that no court could heal. The memory of laughter turning to screams, of kindness crushed under rage, shaped him into someone older than his years. Yet within his grief, there was also resilience. He told the truth when it mattered most, and in that truth, he found a kind of strength. Still, the loss of the cook, the only man who had given him joy without condition, stayed with him. His smiles when they came were rare, softer, touched by the shadow of what had been taken. For the community, the trial confirmed what many had suspected. It became a mirror reflecting the ugliness of pride, the cruelty of unchecked power, and the consequences of silence. The cook, once overlooked as just another servant, became something more in memory, a symbol of kindness in a world that had devalued him, a reminder of how easily lives can be crushed under the weight of arrogance. His death stirred questions about justice, about whose lives are valued, and about the invisible lines that divide people by class and color. The story touched something deeper than the crime itself. It laid bare the dangers of power when it goes unchecked, of wealth when it blinds men to their own humanity. It showed how love can be twisted by pride, how silence can become its own form of betrayal, how a single act of kindness can ripple outward long after death. The millionaire had believed control could keep his world intact, but in the end, control destroyed him. The cook, though stripped of his life, left behind something his killer never could. The memory of love without condition, a kind of dignity that not even violence could erase. Was justice served? In one sense, yes. The court handed down its sentence, the truth was acknowledged, and the murderer faced the consequences of his actions. But justice is rarely so simple. The cook's life could not be returned. The boy's laughter would never be the same. The wife's silence could never be undone. Justice, in this case, came not as healing, but as acknowledgement, a public naming of what had been done. It was necessary, but it did not erase the losses that weighed so heavily on those left behind. The broader lessons lingered long after the case closed. People in the town spoke of it for years, not just as a tragedy, but as a warning. Power, they realized, can become its own form of violence if not tempered by compassion. Pride, left unchecked, can turn love into possession, protection into destruction. And silence, even from those who mean no harm, can become the soil in which cruelty grows. The story became more than just a tale of a murder in a wealthy home. It became a meditation on human nature itself, the fragile line between love and control, the cost of pride, the ways people justify their darkest acts. It revealed that crime is not always born in the shadows of strangers, but often within the walls of our own homes, in the spaces where silence and power collide. And so, the mansion remained, its walls no longer admired but feared, its silence no longer envied but pitied. It stood as a monument to what happens when kindness is seen as a threat, when love is suffocated by control, and when a single moment of rage can undo lives forever. The millionaire lost everything. The wife faded into silence. The boy carried his grief into manhood. The community carried the memory as a scar, and the cook, though gone, remained in the story, in the whispers, in the lessons carved into the hearts of those who remembered him. In the end, the crime was not only about the violence of one man. It was about the deeper truths it revealed, that power without compassion is dangerous, that silence can kill as surely as action, and that even the smallest moments of kindness, though fleeting, can leave behind echoes that outlast violence. It was a reminder that justice, while necessary, can never fully heal what pride and cruelty destroy. The echoes of that night never left the house, the family, or the town. And perhaps that was the truest legacy of all. Not the wealth, not the reputation, but the haunting reminder of what happens when humanity is lost in the pursuit of control.